Welcome to a new episode. In June 1981, American police received one of the most bizarre phone calls in their history. The caller's voice trembled with tears as he sobbed into the receiver. "I'm sorry. I can't control myself anymore. Every so often, I kill someone." At first, investigators dismissed it as a prank call, some sick individual looking for attention. But this haunting confession was just the beginning of a story stranger than fiction. This case became infamous across America as the Weeping Killer, and today we're diving deep into this chilling cold case. The Discovery. Our investigation takes us to St. Paul, Minnesota, on June 3, 1981. On the outskirts of the city, a group of teenagers playing soccer in a vacant lot made a horrifying discovery: a body lying motionless on the ground. When police arrived at the scene, they found the victim face down, a young woman who had suffered multiple stab wounds to her chest and abdomen, with additional lacerations on her thighs. The first questions were obvious. Who was this woman? And who had done this to her? The location was a construction zone for a new highway, completely isolated with no witnesses in sight. There was no evidence left behind, no clues to follow. The body was transported to the medical examiner, where the full extent of the brutality became clear. The coroner's report was staggering: 61 stab wounds. The wound patterns indicated the weapon was something like a screwdriver. Investigators now knew their murder weapon, but they were left stunned by the sheer violence unleashed on this young woman. The level of rage was beyond comprehension. But who was she, and why had she been targeted? The victim carried no identification, but investigators found a key hidden in her clothing, a locker key. Their investigation led them to a bus station, where they opened the locker and discovered 2 bags containing books and an ID card. The victim was Kimberly Compton, just 18 years old. The victim's story detectives contacted Kimberly's family and delivered the devastating news. They learned she had just arrived in St. Paul on the very day she was murdered. Kimberly was described as social, kind-hearted, and trusting, perhaps too trusting. After graduating high school, she had decided to move to St. Paul to find work and start a new life. Tragically, the day she arrived seeking a fresh beginning became her last day on Earth. While Kimberly's family struggled to process their loss, investigators desperately searched for any lead that might point them toward the killer. They needed to piece together what happened from the moment she stepped off that bus in St. Paul. Then, just 2 days later, the police department received a phone call that would change everything. The confession calls. The caller was sobbing, his voice shaking with what seemed like genuine remorse and grief. As you heard in that audio, the man was clearly distraught, but initially investigators thought it was just another hoax, someone seeking twisted entertainment. But then the caller revealed something that made them take notice. He mentioned stabbing the victim with a screwdriver. This detail had never been released to the media. Only the killer would know this. Police attempted to trace the call, but it was too brief. Hours later, the phone rang again. In the second call, the man claimed he had stabbed her 51 times. He continued, "I can't handle being around people anymore. If I don't stop myself, I'll end my own life. I'm going to hurt someone else." Investigators were baffled by the caller's apparent remorse and emotional breakdown. This time, he stayed on the line long enough for them to trace the call to a phone booth outside the bus station. Police rushed to the location and lifted fingerprints from the booth. But with so many people using public phones, isolating the killer's prints proved impossible. They decided to stake out the phone booth, hoping he would call again. For days, they watched and waited, but the mysterious caller didn't return. A pattern emerges. Investigators began analyzing the recorded calls themselves, focusing on the distinctive voice, high-pitched and filled with genuine-sounding remorse. They compared it to recordings from other unsolved cases involving similar suspects. That's when they made a startling discovery. 5 months earlier, someone had called emergency services about a woman found between life and death. The voice bore a striking resemblance to their weeping confessor, but in that earlier call, he had been seeking help to save a victim, not confessing to murder. The first attack on January 1st, 1981, at approximately 3 a.m., emergency services received a frantic call. The sobbing caller pleaded, "Please send an ambulance quickly. There's a girl here who's been hurt." Police and paramedics rushed to the scene and found a young woman on the ground in critical condition. She was naked and had been brutally beaten with a heavy object to her head and neck. Miraculously, she was still alive. Her ID revealed she was Karen Potak, a 20-year-old college student. Investigators contacted her family and learned she had been celebrating New Year's Eve with friends at a downtown bar. But Karen seemed upset. That night, and around midnight, she simply vanished. Her friends assumed she had gone home alone and left without her. Later, they received the devastating phone call that their friend was in the hospital. Detectives attempted to interview Karen in the hospital, but she couldn't remember anything about the attack. Though she survived, she suffered severe brain injuries and memory loss, making her unable to describe her attacker or recall any details of that night. Their only witness couldn't help them, and their only lead remained those haunting phone calls. The connection: when Karen's attack occurred, investigators couldn't identify the perpetrator. Now, 5 months later, the same voice that had called for help was confessing to murder, not reporting a crime, but admitting to being the killer. The voice, the tone, the crying pattern, it was unmistakably the same person. Investigators were now certain they were dealing with the same perpetrator in both cases. They combed through old case files, searching for anyone who had used a screwdriver as a weapon, but weeks of investigation yielded nothing. Desperate for a breakthrough, they turned to the media. Public Appeal Police released portions of the recorded calls to local news outlets. The response was immediate. That same night, over 150 people called the police, claiming they recognized the voice or knew who it belonged to. Unfortunately, none of these tips led anywhere. The case remained cold, but the story had captured the public's attention across the country. The media coined a name that would stick: the Weeping Killer. 2 months later, police received a report of a hostage situation. False led a man named Edwin Lopez had barricaded himself in his home with his family as hostages. When police surrounded the house and began negotiating over the phone, Lopez shocked everyone by claiming responsibility for Kimberly's murder. The situation was extremely dangerous: an armed suspect holding his family hostage while confessing to one of the city's most heinous crimes. When police stormed the house, they discovered Lopez had killed his father, mother, and sister. He was arrested and continued insisting he was the Weeping Killer. But confessions alone aren't enough. Investigators needed evidence linking Lopez to Kimberly's murder. They investigated his background, discovering a history of violent assaults and mental health treatment. However, when they compared Lopez's voice recordings from the hostage situation to their Weeping Killer tapes, the voices didn't match. 6 months after his arrest, Lopez took his own life in custody. Another 6 months passed without any new calls, leading investigators to wonder if Lopez had been telling the truth after all. The third victim, on August 6, 1982, nearly a year later, a newspaper delivery boy walking along a riverbank noticed eyeglasses on the ground. Moving closer to investigate, he spotted what he initially thought was a discarded doll. When he touched it, he realized it was a real body. Police arrived to find another victim who had been beaten about the head and face and stabbed multiple times. The wound patterns clearly indicated a screwdriver had been used, the same weapon their phone caller had described. But was this merely a coincidence? The victim carried no identification, and the medical examiner found no immediate clues about the motive. 2 days later, the phone rang again. As you heard, the voice, the crying, the pattern, it was identical to the previous calls. After a year and a half since Karen's attack and 14 months since Kimberly's murder, investigators finally confirmed that Lopez was not the Weeping Killer. FBI profile. Desperate for answers, investigators contacted the FBI for assistance in understanding why the killer kept calling police, essentially increasing his chances of being caught. After studying the recorded calls, behavioral analysts concluded the caller behaved like a small child, crying and seeking attention, as if wanting to say, "Now you know who I am. I'm the one doing all this." Meanwhile, investigators identified their latest victim through a purse found in a mailbox near the bus station, the same station where Kimberly had arrived. The victim was Barbara Virginia Simons, a 40-year-old nurse. The witness family members revealed Barbara had gone to a South Side bar that night. When investigators interviewed the bar staff, 2 servers remembered seeing Barbara with a man. Disturbingly, she had told one of the servers she needed someone to drive her home and hoped this guy turns out to be decent. The server also noted the man made strange facial expressions and kept looking him up and down suspiciously. The server described the suspect as a white male in his early 40s, muscular build, approximately 6 feet tall, with a mustache. Finally, they had a description and witnesses who had seen the suspect face to face. The breakthrough investigators pulled assault case files and selected photos of criminals matching the witness description. When they showed 8 photographs to the bar staff, they immediately identified one man, Paul Michael Stefani. Born September 8, 1944, Stefani had a record of prior assault convictions. Most importantly, he worked for Malberg Manufacturing, located in the same area where Karen had been attacked. Paul Stefani became their prime suspect. Before questioning him, investigators decided to place him under surveillance. They positioned a team outside his apartment complex. One day, they observed Stefani leaving his building in his car and began following him, but lost him in traffic. Hours later, police received another emergency call, someone reporting a woman who needed help immediately. The caller said he had witnessed a man stabbing a woman with a screwdriver and tried to intervene, but the suspect fled in his vehicle. When police arrived, they found a woman stabbed 13 times, but she survived the attack. The survivor. The victim was Denise Williams, a 21-year-old sex worker. She explained that the man who attacked her was a client who had offered to drive her home. Instead, he stopped near a warehouse district, pulled a screwdriver from his glove compartment, and began stabbing her. Denise found an empty soda bottle in the car, broke it across his face, and escaped. He pursued her and continued the attack, until a witness appeared, causing him to flee. That same night, shortly after the attack on Denise Williams, someone called for an ambulance. The surveillance team at Stefani's apartment building saw an ambulance arrive. When they contacted emergency services, they learned Stefani had called for medical help. He was bleeding and couldn't stop the flow. The arrest investigators showed Denise a photo lineup, and she immediately identified Paul Stefani as her attacker. Stefani was arrested and questioned. When asked about his facial wound, he claimed someone had tried to rob him. Initially calm. During questioning, his demeanor completely changed when the investigator placed victim photos in front of him. His voice shifted as he angrily demanded, "Are you trying to frame me for this?" The investigator was struck by how dramatically Stefani's personality changed in seconds and how his voice matched the recordings. With voice similarity and eyewitness identification, investigators were confident they had their man. However, they lacked evidence connecting him to Karen's and Kimberly's cases. The phone recordings weren't sufficient evidence, so they could only charge him with attacking Denise Williams and murdering Barbara Simons. The psychology investigators and psychiatrists studied Stefani's background, trying to understand what had driven him to such extreme violence and why he called police to confess. They learned he came from a very religious family, leading them to theorize he might have believed confessing his crimes would earn God's forgiveness. His childhood was difficult. His parents divorced, and his stepfather mistreated him. He had been engaged to a woman who returned to Syria and married someone else in an arranged marriage. Investigators believed when Stephanie attacked these women, he was likely seeking revenge against the woman who had abandoned him. The trial. On February 28, 1984, Stephanie's trial began for assaulting Denise Williams and murdering Barbara Simons. The prosecution's key evidence was his distinctive phone call confessions. They attempted to bring in a voice expert to prove the recorded voice belonged to Paul Stephanie, but the judge ruled the expert's testimony inadmissible. However, the prosecution had a much more powerful witness, Stephanie's own sister. When she heard the recordings, she broke down and confirmed it was her brother Paul's voice. This moment was devastating in the courtroom, and the jury was convinced of his guilt. Stephanie was sentenced to 18 years for the assault on Denise Williams and 40 years for murdering Barbara Simons. But the story wasn't over. Final confessions. More than 10 years after his conviction, Paul Stephanie called the detective who had worked his case from prison. He offered to confess to everything in exchange for a favor. 2 detectives visited him in prison where he made an unusual request. He wanted them to photograph his mother's gravestone and bring him the pictures. Only then would he reveal everything. After they complied, Stephanie confessed to Karen's attack and Kimberly's murder, the case's investigators had always suspected him of committing. But he also confessed to a third murder no one knew about, the hidden victim. Though Stephanie couldn't remember many details about this third victim, he said he had drowned her in a bathtub. Investigators searched drowning cases from the time frame. He indicated until they found a match. Kathy Greening, a 33-year-old teacher found drowned in her bathtub in July 1982. Her death had been ruled undetermined, and her husband had been a suspect, though he was never charged. Stephanie provided details only the killer could know, such as placing her purse in a mailbox, the same method he had used with Barbara. When investigators reviewed the case evidence, they found Paul Stephanie's name and phone number in Kathy's address book. Kathy Greening was Stephanie's third victim, killed just 2 weeks before he met Barbara. Yet mysteriously, he never called police to confess to Kathy's murder, as he had with the others. The final interview. A journalist visited Stephanie in prison, hoping to understand the motivation behind his phone calls and crimes. Stephanie couldn't provide a clear reason for why he killed these women, saying he didn't understand it himself. He claimed he heard voices commanding him to kill. Describing how he murdered Kathy, he said, "I remember I was smiling like we were playing a game, but suddenly I felt my hands shaking and I thought to myself, what are you doing? This girl is going to die in your hands." He revealed that after committing crimes, he would go to church, sit there reflecting on his actions, and wonder if God was angry with him. When asked why he finally decided to confess after all these years, Stephanie revealed he had cancer and wanted to apologize to the victims' families before he died. The end. On June 12, 1998, Paul Michael Stephanie died in the prison hospital. And that concludes this chilling case of the Weeping Killer, a man whose crimes terrorized a community, yet whose recorded confessions revealed a deeply troubled individual seemingly tormented by his own actions. What drives someone to commit such heinous acts while simultaneously seeking to confess them? The psychology of Paul Michael Stephanie remains as mysterious as the haunting phone calls that first brought him to the attention of law enforcement. The victims, Kimberly Compton, Karen Potak, Barbara Simons, Denise Williams, and Kathy Greening, will never be forgotten. Their stories serve as a reminder of lives cut short by senseless violence and the importance of never giving up in the pursuit of justice. What are your thoughts on this case? Share your opinions in the comments, and we'll see you in the next episode.